far into the night. Each day he received instructions from 2 Brahmins, and very soon knew everything that seemed necessary. He thenceforward attended the sacrifices, dispensed justice, and practiced the arts of knighthood and war. The Brahmin Gopala initiated him into politics, informed him of the position of his house and its laws, the claims of his future heir, and the nature of his foes. First and foremost of who was Nala's mother, who had once robbed Prince Dasa of his rights, who had designs upon his life, and who now hated him more than ever as the murderer of her son. She had fled to the palace of the neighboring Prince Govinda and had placed herself under his protection. This Govinda and his house were also enemies and were dangerous. They had already been at war with Dasa's forebears and laid claim to certain portions of his territory. As opposed to this, his southern neighbor, the Prince Gopali, who had been a friend of Dasa's father and had not been able to suffer Nala, it would be an important duty to visit him, to take him presents, and to invite him hunting in the near future. The Lady Parvati had assumed her role of a princess to perfection. She understood how to behave regally and looked magnificent in her beautiful garments and jewels. In fact, she looked for all the world as though she were no less well-bred than her husband. They lived in blissful happiness year after year, and their happiness gave them that certain glamour and charm only possessed by those whom the gods favor, so that they were loved and venerated by all. And when, after a long period of waiting, Parvati presented him with a son, who he christened Ravana after his own father. His cup was full, and all that he possessed in the way of land, power, houses, stables, dairies, cattle, and horses assumed henceforth a double importance and meaning in his eyes, assumed an increased splendor and value. All this property had been magnificent and gratifying to the extent that he had been able to surround Parvati with luxury, clothes, and jewels. But it was now doubly magnificent and gratifying in that it was constituted the heritage and future happiness of his son, Ravana. If Parvati derived her pleasures mainly from feasts, outings, pomp, and extravagance, from clothes, jewels, and servants, Dasa's chief joy lay in his garden, which he had planted with rare and costly trees and flowers, and in which he had installed parrots and other bright-colored birds. Their daily feeding was one of his greatest amusements. In addition to this, he was attracted to learning, and as a grateful pupil of the Brahmins, learned many verses and axioms in the art of reading and writing. He understood how to prepare palm leaves for writing, and under his loving care a little library began to accumulate. Here, among his books, in small tasteful room, with walls of precious woods upon which the lives of gods were carved and part gilded, he sometimes allowed the Brahmin guests, the cream of the scholars and thinkers among the priests, to argue upon holy things, upon the creation of the world, upon the Maya of the great Vishnu, upon the sacred Vedas, the power of sacrifice, and the might of penance, through which a mortal could make the gods fear and tremble before him. The Brahmins, who had spoken best in dispute and argument, received sumptuous presents and Many of them would bear away a fine cow as a prize for a victorious argument. It was at once ludicrous and a little touching to see one of them, who had just been declaiming and commenting upon the precepts of the Vedas, and who was equally at home in all heavens and oceans, was proud and puffed up with his gifts of honor and defeats, lapsing into jealous bickering with others. Occasionally it seemed to Prince Dasa that his wealth, happiness, garden, books, in fact, all and everything that belonged to life and humanity, were strange and dubious, and at the same time pathetic. Like those vain, wise Brahmins, alternately light and dark, inevitable or despicable, sometimes when his eyes fell upon a lotus bloom in his garden, upon the brilliant plumage of his peasants, peacocks, and egrets, or upon the gilded carvings in his palace, these things would seem to him divine and glowing with eternal life, and at other times, even at the same time, he would find them something unreliable, questionable, something transitory and ephemeral. A readiness to sink one more into the formless, into chaos, just as he himself, Prince Dasa, had once been a prince, and then became a herdsman, murderer, and outlaw, only to rise to the dignity of princehood once more, led and commanded by unknown powers, uncertain of today or of tomorrow. So the Maya game comprised the whole of life, the exalted and the humble, eternity and death, the great and the ridiculous. Even she, even this beautiful and loved Parvati, at moments seemed to lose her magic and would appear a little ridiculous with so many bangles upon her arms, so much pride and triumph in her eyes, and so studied a dignity in her gait. More prized, however, than his garden and his books was his little son, Ravana, the consummation of his love and the high point of his destiny, the object of his tenderness and care, a gentle, lovely child, a true prince, with the gazelle-like eyes of his mother and the trace of his father's dreamy thoughtfulness. Sometimes, when he saw the little boy standing in revere before an ornamental tree, or when he surprised him squatting on a carpet examining a stone or carved toy or a bird's feather, deep contemplation, with somewhat raised eyebrows and faraway look in his eyes, then he would seem to be a true son of his father. How much he loved him, Dasa only realized when he was forced to leave him for unspecified period of time. A fast-riding messenger had arrived from that neighborhood where his lands bordered upon those Govinda, announcing that Govinda's people had invaded, stolen cattle, and borne away a number of men and prisoners. Without stopping to reflect, Dasa had prepared himself, gathered together a dozen horsemen under the colonel of the bodyguard, and gone off in pursuit of the robbers. When at the moment of departure he had taken his little son in his arms and kissed him, he had felt a fiery pang in his heart, which had been both surprising and touching, like a warning from the unknown. And during his long ride, the knowledge of his love and devotion waxed to become a realization and certainty. He had preoccupied himself with reflecting as to the actual reasons for his being on horseback, and as to why he was riding so hastily through his lands. What power it could be that compelled him to such a deed and to such a strenuous efforts. Upon deep consideration, he had realized that in his heart it was not really important and did not even bring him sorrow if, somewhere on his frontiers, he had been robbed of men and cattle, that this insult to his princely rights would not suffice to arouse him to anger and action, and that it would have been more seemly to have received the news of cattle theft with compassionate smile, and yet at the same time he knew that he would be committing a bitter wrong against the messenger who had been hastened to the point of exhaustion to bring him the news, and no less so against the men who had been robbed and against those who had been taken prisoner, who had been dragged from their homes and peaceful lives and carried off into foreign slavery. Indeed, he would have wronged all his other subjects who had remained unscathed had he renounced a warlike revenge. They would have borne it badly and would have not understood why their prince had so ill protected their land, and none of them were they, in turn, to be subject to a deed of violence, could count upon aid and revenge. He saw, therefore, that it was his duty to undertake this raid of reprisal. But what is duty? How many duties are there not that we often shirk without any heart pangs? How did it happen that in this duty of revenge did not come within the category of those that were a matter of indifference? That he could not shirk it, that he could not complete it half-heartedly and wearily, but had to go through with it with zeal and passion. Hardly had the question arisen in his mind than his heart had already found the answer, inasmuch as it was still trembling from the pain of taking leave of Ravana, his little son. Were the prince to allow his cattle and his people to be stolen without offering resistance, then robbery and violence would spread inwards from the frontiers of his land until at last the enemy would be able to attack him where he was capable of the greatest hurt, in the capital. They would rob him of his son, his successor. They would take him and kill him, perhaps with torture, and this was the utmost suffering that he could imagine, far worse even than the death of Pravati. He therefore rode zealously and played the dutiful prince, not because he was chagrined at the loss of cattle and land, not out of the goodwill of his subjects and not out of the pride of his parental princely name, but because of a robust and insane love for his child, and because of a robust fear of the pain that the loss of his child would cause him. These were the conclusions he came to during his ride. He did not, as a matter of fact, succeed in catching Govinda's men and punishing them, for they had all escaped after their raid. In order to show his resolution, he was obliged himself to violate the frontier in turn, to lay waste to a village and carry off a few cattle and villagers. He had remained absent for many days, and during the homeward ride had given away once more to deep thought. On his return to the palace, he was very quiet and sorrowful, for he had realized in the course of these reflections how completely and inextricably he had been caught up and ensnared in a cunning net, without hope of escape, as a result of his actions and his whole attitude, while on one hand his preference for thought and his need for quiet observation, for an actionless and innocent life, increased day by day. His love for Ravana, on the other hand, grew proportionately. And out of care for his existence and future arose the compulsion to action with the inevitable entanglements. Out of the tenderness grew conflict, and out of love, war. No sooner had he robbed a herd or sacked a village and carried off poor innocent men with violence, even though he were justified in doing so, then it would naturally be followed by new revenge and even more violence, until his whole life and his whole of his country would be involved in war, violence, and the clash of arms. This was the vision that he had seen on his homeward ride, and which had made him appear so quiet and sorrowful.